From here in Washington is Kurt Volker. He is a former U.S. ambassador to NATO, as well as former U.S. special representative for Ukrainian negotiations. Of course, a big focus going forward is what will the new president-elect do as regards Ukraine and Russia. Good to have you on, sir. So what is your best guess as to what Trump's plan is? I spoke to a number of Trump's former senior advisors who told me Trump would most likely end U.S. military aid to Ukraine and seek some sort of accommodation to Russian territorial gains so far. Do you agree with that assessment?
I don't agree with that assessment. Of course, I'm willing to be proven wrong. But what I see is a situation where Trump wants to end the war. He wants this war to be over. And the only reason there is a war is because Vladimir Putin is willing to attack and take what he wants from Ukraine. So if you want to end the war, you have to convince Putin that it is not in his interest the war, that there will be costs to Putin if he does so. What we know so far is that, according to reports, Trump spoke with Putin on Thursday and said, don't do anything new. That is already a beginning of that conversation, is that you, Vladimir, need to stop the war. We hope that that's the way that that plays out, but we don't know everything and we won't know everything. But in terms of the dynamics, Putin is the one who is waging the war. Putin is the one who has to be convinced it's not in his interest to do so.
That is a fact. Of course, it is Russia that invaded in February 2022. But as you know, many in Trump's orbit have attacked the Ukrainian president. They've made claims about him taking this money to buy yachts, which is factually not true. And they've often in public made the case that it was Ukraine's fault to some degree, or NATO's fault that Russia invaded. You know that school of thought that is quite active on the right. And Donald Trump himself has often attacked the Ukrainian president and others. So do you believe that was just campaign talk, or that exposes his actual view of this conflict?
Well, I honestly think we need to break this down. What you said about the views of some people on the far right is exactly right. They have said those things. They believe those things. They think Zelensky is corrupt or not a serious leader, taking American money, blah, blah, blah. Trump has never said those things. And so we need to appreciate the fact that he is maintaining a distance between all of those points of view. He has also not criticized Vladimir Putin. He's not said that this is a Russian aggression, it needs to stop. But my view is that the reason why he is not criticizing Putin is because he knows he ultimately has to reach a deal with Putin. And so he's not demonizing him. But that doesn't mean that he misunderstands the situation on the ground. I think we have to see how this plays out. And I would just remind viewers that it was actually President Trump who reversed the Obama administration's arms embargo on Ukraine. For years, we had a ban on lethal assistance to Ukraine, which Trump reversed. And not because he was all of a sudden, challenging Vladimir Putin. Quite the opposite. He was even having this press conference in Helsinki in 2018, where he was very warm towards Vladimir Putin, but he was setting the stage for future negotiations.
Well, to be fair, yes, he did allow the supply of lethal aid to Ukraine. But as you know, he also suspended military assistance to Ukraine as he was pressuring Zelensky to open up an investigation against the man who was going to be running against him in the 2020 election. So it's been an uneven record at best as regards Ukraine. And we should note, it's not just folks floating out in the right-wing, Twitter sphere who have made such claims. J.D. Vance, I mean, he in the last days of the campaign, said something along the lines of who are the good guys and bad guys in a war that, as you well know, was started when Russia invaded. So I just wonder when you put that together and you also add into it the president-elect's frequent criticism of NATO and his public statements along the lines of, well, if you don't pay enough money, then Russia do whatever the hell you want to the east. I mean, it raises at a minimum reasonable questions about his commitment to Ukraine.
For sure.
Yeah.
No, for sure. And I think that the point that I would go to is where Trump consistently says, every time he's asked about this, He says, "Oh, this would never have happened if I was president."
Right.
Well, what do you think he means by that? I think he means that Biden is weak and he would be strong and he would be seen as strong in the world. Now, that may be his own vision of himself and things, but if that is his vision, that he is going to be strong in contrast to Biden's weakness,
Mm.
then that means there needs to be a stronger posture towards Vladimir Putin. And he often points to Afghanistan as a catastrophe for the Biden administration, this American withdrawal, this embarrassment. And he didn't do that. He cannot afford for Ukraine to be his Afghanistan.
Mm. It's a fair point. Kurt Volker, always good to hear your point of view. Thanks so much for joining us this Sunday night.
Jim, thank you so much.
I'm sure we'll talk again